Good day. Today is Friday, 24th January 2025, and we've had another day in the second presidency of Donald Trump. And I'm going to say briefly that all of these days since he became president have been marked by extraordinary activity, exuberance, and a certain degree of confusion. And in relation to the conflict in Ukraine, increasingly so. But before I get into the details of all of that, I have to return to the topic of my program yesterday, because I began yesterday's program by mentioning that Donald Trump, that the new administration had suspended arms deliveries to Ukraine for 90 days, and that all of the individuals who had been involved in the delivery of those arms had been suspended pending further investigation in light of possible financial irregularities. Now, after I made my program, and I believe after my program appeared, the Pentagon published a statement in which they said that that was not in fact the case, that there's been no suspension of arms deliveries by the administration to Ukraine. They didn't say anything about investigations of anybody in the Pentagon over the arms deliveries, and they went on to explain that the executive order that Donald Trump signed a few days previously, which did indeed suspend foreign aid for 90 days, generically, not just to Ukraine, that did not cover the arms supplies to Ukraine itself. Now, that, I accept, isn't straightforward and categorical denial, and it's important to say at the outset that the information I gave, therefore, in my program yesterday about American arms deliveries to Ukraine being suspended, well, the Pentagon has now confirmed that that is wrong. However, I'm going to have to make a few observations of my own. Firstly, I never myself linked this decision, as I believed it to be, to suspend arms deliveries to Ukraine with the executive order that the Pentagon is talking about. I'd read various reports in various places that there had been a suspension of military deliveries to Ukraine, and I understood this to be entirely separate from the executive order, which I'd already read and commented about in a previous program, and which I didn't think did in fact concern military deliveries to Ukraine. Now, it is quite possible that a lot of people, or some people, or a few people, put two and two together, looked at the executive order, told each other that military aid to Ukraine had been suspended, and on the basis of this executive order, that I picked all of that up, and as a result, I conveyed their wrong information. In which case, I must provide a complete and unequivocal apology. However, I do find it strange, if it was just, a few people like that the Pentagon would have gone out of its way to publish a statement of the sort that it did. It seems to me that rather more new rumours to this effect must have been circulating, and that the Pentagon was keen, and the administration was keen, to scotch them. Well, I'm not going to dwell more on this issue. It's embarrassing for myself to say something and to have it refuted just a few hours later. I don't want to make excuses for myself in that respect. The fact is that it seems that for the moment, arms deliveries to Ukraine are continuing, are ongoing. And going back to earlier comments I made on previous programs, there is still or there was still, when Donald Trump entered the presidency, $3.8 billion left from Congress's April appropriation. There are still lots of weapon systems, presumably in transit to Ukraine, previously authorized by the Biden administration. So it looks as if whatever Donald Trump decides to do, unless he makes a positive order to stop arms deliveries, and there may be problems with that, given that he would be interfering with a congressional appropriation. It looks as if the arms supplies for the moment are going to continue. I'll just quickly, and in my own defense, say that obviously over the last couple of days, I have not been fully myself. And it may be that I myself, reading the various reports, didn't analyse and catalogue them properly. And if so, again, let me repeat, I apologise. Now, let's now move on to what Donald Trump has been doing and saying over the last couple of hours, because he's been saying an awful lot, and I would suggest that he's been saying an awful lot too much. He's been continuing to talk about the fact that there needs to be a deal done. He said that President Zelensky and Ukraine are ready for a deal. And I have repeatedly expressed my bewilderment about this, because I have seen no sign, no public sign, that President Zelensky is, in fact, ready or interested in a deal. Donald Trump has also been talking about doing things to lower oil prices, and he's spoken about a very friendly conversation he's had with MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and he doesn't understand, apparently, why the Saudis haven't already been lowering oil prices, and he wants them to do that right away, to lower oil prices radically. And Donald Trump also says that if oil prices are lowered in that kind of way, then that will end the war, because the Russians won't be able to fund their war if oil prices collapse. That was what he said. And he said that over the course of a speech to the World Economic Forum. He didn't actually go to Davos himself. He communicated this virtually, but anyway, he did make his speech there. And he also said that he wanted to talk to China, to President Xi Jinping, and he was expecting President Xi Jinping to, he was looking to President Xi Jinping to help him move forward with achieving peace in Ukraine and doing so quickly. And that he looks for help from China for that. And he said that he has excellent relations, or has had historically very good relations, person-to-person relations with President Xi Jinping, and he's had good relations with China, something the Chinese might find surprising, but anyway, that he's had good relations with China, and he seems confident, so he gave the impression that the Chinese would be happy to go along with that, to put pressure on the Russians. So those were some of the things that Donald Trump said in his speech to the World Economic Forum. He's also said lots of other very strange things, such as that the Russians stole or somehow acquired hypersonic technology from the United States during the period of Obama's presidency, which I don't know any engineer or scientist who's ever suggested such a thing. And, well, to say it straightforwardly, that is flatly wrong. The Russians began work on hypersonic technology at least as far back as the 1970s, and their recent breakthroughs in hypersonic technology are a product of that long research. He's also again said that he is anxious to meet Putin, and that he wants to meet Putin as soon as possible, and he seems to be leaving it open to Putin to decide the venue. Now, before I start to unpack all of this, I think a first point needs to be made, which is that this is very unconventional way of signalling to the other side in what is likely to be a very complicated and difficult negotiation indeed that you want to negotiate. Many times in my life, during the Cold War and after, I remember people saying that megaphone diplomacy in negotiations between superpowers never worked well and was best avoided. Well, this is megaphone diplomacy with a vengeance. But going beyond the detail, I think that it is conveying to the Russians a completely different impression from the one I think that Donald Trump wants them to have. The Russians, first and foremost, what they see is that Donald Trump appears to be very, very keen indeed to settle the war in Ukraine. Notice that it is not the Russians who are calling on the Americans to begin negotiations. It is Donald Trump who is urgently demanding a meeting with Putin and who wants Putin to do a deal. That does convey a certain sense that at this particular point in time, Donald Trump needs a deal from Putin. He wants a deal. He wants the war to end. And this is for him a priority. Now that may be true and it may be commendable, but it also risks giving the Russians leverage, because the Russians will say to themselves, well, here's Donald Trump. He's very keen to make a deal. Well, he's engaging in a great deal of blustering, but we can disregard that, because somebody who is so keen to make a deal over the course of negotiations is someone who might make concessions. Now, I say that as somebody who, like Donald Trump, has been involved in negotiations in the business world. But I also say that as somebody who's observed international diplomacy all of my adult life, who's read diplomatic histories and all these sort of things. I think that this, as I say, does risk in conveying a wrong signal. Now, the other thing it is doing, all of these various statements that Donald Trump is making, is that it's conveying to the Russians two other things, which perhaps it was better that they were not thinking at this time. The first is that Trump doesn't actually know very much about the situation and doesn't understand it very well. That is one. And the second is that he is actually without a plan. Now let's go to the first one quickly, because Trump has been talking about the war being a disaster for Russia, about Russia having a failing economy, about the Russians having lost 1 million men on the battlefields, killed. Well, Trump is right about one thing. He's spoken about Ukraine as killing fields, and that is exactly what they are becoming. But to be absolutely clear, my overwhelming sense is that the killing fields are now increasingly killing Ukrainian soldiers rather than Russian ones. And my own further view is that the great balance of evidence points to Ukrainian losses being much more severe than the Russian ones. Now, here perhaps Donald Trump should listen to people like Douglas McGregor and Michael Vlachos and people like that, who have given their own numbers about Ukrainian and Russian losses. Michael Vlachos, in particular, has recently written a rather interesting piece about this, suggesting that Ukrainian losses are indeed very, very high and much higher than the Ukrainians themselves admit. Now, Trump acknowledges this, but if he's going on to claim that Russian losses are even higher, then he is conveying to the Russians that he genuinely doesn't know what he's talking about. And when he tells the Russians that their economy is collapsing, when the Russians are the best people to know that that is not the case, well, then the view in Moscow that Donald Trump doesn't know what he's talking about is going to be confirmed. And then, of course, there's the point about Donald Trump being without a plan. Because one way of understanding his multiple comments over the last couple of hours is that what we see is Donald Trump, in advance of a negotiation, desperately trying to find some form of leverage. So, in his notorious post on Truth Social, one which I think is now increasingly acknowledged by people who study these things carefully, was actually a mistake. It set the wrong tone. It offended the Russians with its bizarre references to World War II without intimidating them. Anyway, in that post, he said this: if we don't make a deal, and soon, I have no other choice but to put high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on anything being sold by Russia to the United States and various other participating countries. Well, that doesn't chime very well with Donald Trump's latest comments to the World Economic Forum, where he spoke about the Saudis needing to reduce oil prices to flood the world with cheap oil in order to put pressure on the Russians to end the war. It looks as if the people who have the leverage over the Russians to end the war are not the Americans at all, but the Saudis. And that what Donald Trump wants is for the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, to do him a favor by flooding the world with cheap oil so as to put pressure on the Russians. Now, there's more to say about this in a moment, but already that doesn't convey a particularly good look. And from the Russian point of view, when they see this kind of confusion, a muddle, and uncertainty, they're going to be preparing themselves. And by the way, a thing to always understand about how Russians conduct negotiations, and I say this from direct knowledge, and anybody who's had any dealings with Russians in commercial negotiations, I am sure will confirm this, and it is no different in diplomatic negotiations as well. Anybody who knows how the Russians conduct negotiations will know that they will come to those negotiations utterly prepared, ready to argue over every single point and to take advantage over any ambiguity and any weakness. Now, that might be what has provoked an extremely strong statement from the Russian Foreign Ministry over the course of today. And this has come from a very senior Russian foreign ministry official, Alexander Grushko, who is Russia's deputy foreign minister. And this related to NATO membership of Ukraine, which Donald Trump says that he understands why the Russians object to it. But Grushko went on to say this: for us, this is a key element of potential agreements on the conflict in Ukraine and an element of removing the root causes of this conflict. And we will be seeking not only rock-steady legal guarantees ruling out any Ukrainian membership in NATO, but we will also demand that the alliance itself embrace this policy. And then he went on to say that Ukraine joining NATO would rule out achieving peace in Ukraine and more broadly establishing any security architecture. And he did acknowledge that there are differences within NATO on this topic. But notice his point that not only must Ukrainian membership of NATO be ruled out, and ruled out in the most legally cast iron, rock steady way, but NATO itself must embrace the policy. In other words, what the Russians are saying is, look, we don't just want you to agree. We don't just want signed documents. We want you to embrace the policy. To yourselves say, we do not want NATO anymore. In fact, not just say it, but actually feel and believe it. Now, how is that going to be possible? Doesn't it also entirely contradict what Keir Starmer signed off on with Vladimir Zelensky just a few days ago, when Starmer signed off on a 100-year partnership agreement, one which specifically spoke about British support for Ukraine's membership of NATO? Well, here we have Grushko, and he's saying that not only must the British, and it's not just the Americans, he's talked about the alliance, not just the Americans, NATO, the British as well, must put all of that aside and must decide that they no longer want NATO membership for Ukraine. That must become their actual desire. Now, I have to say, I think this is an impossible demand, but it flows directly, I think, from what Trump has been saying over the last couple of days. And in my opinion, it is a not untypical response from the Russians when they see a chaotic and unprepared team on the other side moving towards negotiations with them. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say. Now let's go back and unpack the various things that Donald Trump has been saying. Firstly, he says that Zelensky wants a deal. I've seen no evidence in any form or place that Vladimir Zelensky wants a deal, at least certainly not any kind of deal that can be negotiated with the Russians. What he wants is Russia's capitulation in one form or another. He has slowly moved away from the impossible position he took until a few months ago of saying that the only basis upon which negotiations could begin is one in which the Russians accepted his peace formula, which required them to withdraw completely from all of former Ukrainian territory that they control, including Crimea, and then negotiations could begin on such things as the reparations the Russians would pay to Ukraine and the war crimes trials that Russian officials would be subjected to and that kind of thing. Zelensky isn't talking about that so much anymore, but he's talking about something which in some ways, from an American point of view, I would have thought was even more dangerous. He's talking about, yes, let's have some kind of cessation of hostilities, though not one that he wants to negotiate himself, but he then wants a huge military force. He's talking about 200,000 men. The Financial Times, by the way, has now said that 200,000 men is impossible. NATO is in no position to deploy that number of forces to Ukraine, and it's not at all clear that Western countries, Western parliaments, Western governments, Western publics would ever agree to any kind of deployment to Ukraine at all. And that's putting aside the issue that before anything like that could happen, the Russians would first have to agree to it, which it is all but inconceivable that they would ever do. So Zelensky is putting forward an already impossible demand as what he wants to see as the outcome of negotiations. One which the Russians are bound to reject and which they will see as confirming that Zelensky is not really interested in negotiations. He also says that he wants American troops to be involved in this peacekeeping force, which is something that apparently Donald Trump categorically rules out. He wants security guarantees. Again, clearly, he wants these security guarantees to come from the United States. As I've discussed in many places, what he's essentially trying to do is he's trying to establish a Western force in Ukraine under cover of a ceasefire. The ceasefire will then collapse, and at that point there will be that Western force in place, and Zelensky will have drawn the West into his war with Russia. So this is actually a very dangerous set of proposals. If Trump thinks that this is Zelensky agreeing to a deal, it is not a deal that Zelensky is proposing. It is a trap, and a very transparent one. As for the Russians, they've made it quite clear that they don't see any sign that Zelensky is seriously interested in negotiating. Peskov, Putin's spokesman, put it very succinctly. Zelensky cannot be ready to make a deal. It is more appropriate to use the word settlement after all. In order to reach a settlement, it is necessary to negotiate. Zelensky has prohibited himself from negotiating by his own decree. And that is true. And recently, the Ukrainian foreign minister confirmed that not only does Zelensky's decree remain in place, but that there are no plans to rescind it. So, I don't see any real sign that the Ukrainians are prepared to sit down with the Russians and negotiate. What they want to do is to get Trump to come to some kind of a ceasefire deal with the Russians, which will result in a major Western force being deployed to Ukraine, which will open the way for a resumption of hostilities, but this time with the Russians and the Ukrainians, with the Western powers involved as well. And notice that he appears to have the backing of the British in all of this. I discussed some days ago an article in the Daily Telegraph by Andrew Blomfield, which set this all out in black and white, how in the event that the ceasefire broke down, the Ukrainians would expect the United States to establish a no-fly zone over Ukraine, in other words, battle the Russian Air Force over the skies of Ukraine, launch mass missile strikes across Russia. With what, one wonders? And how would the Russians respond to that? That would be an absolute act of war, one which the Russians would be certain to respond to in turn, and, well, in effect, to win the war for Ukraine. A war which, without the West, Ukraine is going to lose. It's all there, clearly set out in Andrew Blomfield's article. And as I pointed out, when I discussed that article appeared direct in a British newspaper directly after Keir Starmer's trip to Kiev, and it was published in a newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which is known to be very in tune with British government thinking. So this is a trap. It's a trap that Zelensky is laying for him, for Trump. It's a trap that Starmer and the British are also laying for him. I think that Trump is deluding himself if he thinks that Zelensky is really up for negotiations or wants to make a deal. I've seen no sign of that. And for the record, for the moment at least, even though Zelensky has at various times been talking about deployment of European peacekeeping forces and security guarantees and those sort of things, his official position remains that his peace formula, the Zelensky plan, the complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from the entirety of pre-2014 Ukraine, that remains his official policy. Now let's turn to the other things that Trump has been talking about. Well, he talked about sanctions. He talked about tariffs and taxes in his famous post. But now he talks about the Saudis flooding the world with oil, and that this is going to force the Russians to back down because they won't be able to afford the war, to continue the war without access to those oil and energy revenues. Now, this is always a deeply frustrating topic because we come back to that perennial problem of Western commentary about Russia, which is that it constantly remains stuck in this belief that dealing with Russia, you are dealing not with a real country, not with a real diversified industrial economy with all kinds of scientific and technological skills and resources, but with basically a vast energy complex which generates money and does nothing much else. The fact that Russia is able to produce 3 times more weapons that the entirety of the collective West is able to do is indeed baffling, but it is explained by facile claims that Russia today is a fully mobilized, militarized war economy, even though, as I've pointed out in many times and in many places, the facts simply do not justify claims like that. If you look at the amount of resources that the Russians are diverting into their military economy, perhaps 6 to 8%, more probably 6% than 8%. 8% almost certainly accounts for other security-related issues like police forces and things of that kind, which should not be taken into account in reaching these calculations. 6% is probably a more correct total. Well, that is far below the 40% of GDP that the United States was devoting to the war during the Second World War. Just saying. So it is ludicrous to talk about this militarized war economy in Russia, jumping on to to particular facts, sometimes important facts, like the fact that the inflation rate has been higher in Russia than the central bank wants it to be, and higher than the government wants it to be, and that there has therefore been overheating in the economy. Well, that is an absolutely valid part of economic commentary when discussing Russia, to talk about that. But it does not speak of a war economy or anything of that kind. It speaks instead of an investment boom being underway. Russian inflation last year was around 9%. It's about the same. That's about the same level of inflation in the United States in 2022. In fact, there are many people who believe that inflation in the United States, real inflation, was well above that number, but let's assume that the two are the same. And just to repeat again, for many reasons I've discussed in other programs, I take Russian inflation statistics as valid. Well, when the United States was running an inflation rate of 9% in 2022, nobody talked about the United States at that time being a war economy. There were other economic reasons for it, of which the sanctions being imposed on the Russian energy sector were one. But the point was, it was not a war economy, and one shouldn't say the same thing about the Russian economy today, because inflation has been running high. just to say this. So anyway, let's unpack these points that Trump has been making about crashing the oil price. Well, let's begin first of all with the rather important personality of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, who would be the person who would be expected to engineer this thing. Now, Donald Trump had a telephone call with MBS, and we have, in fact, a readout of this call from the White House. And like all White House readouts, and this is a consistent fact of all administrations, it is completely uninformative. But it says, on Wednesday, President Trump held his first foreign call with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The two leaders discussed efforts to bring stability to the Middle East, bolster regional security, and combat terrorism. Additionally, they discussed the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's international economic ambitions over the next 4 years, as well as trade and other opportunities to increase the mutual prosperity of the United States and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Donald Trump tells us that MBS told him over the course of this call that the Saudis intend to invest $600 billion in the US economy over the next 4 years. And Trump said, well, why not round it up to a full trillion? Which is very typical of Trump, by the way. But if we take this readout at its, at face value, it doesn't seem here as if the topic of the oil price was discussed at all. And, well, maybe it was. But here we come back to the big question about the Saudis. Because the Saudis, inevitably, if they are on the receiving end of a demand from Donald Trump to flood the world with cheap oil, are inevitably going to ask the question, why? Why? Why should they do that? What is in it for them? Why would the Saudis go out of their way to lower the oil price for an American president or for the United States. It is something that the Saudis have consistently resisted doing over the last few years. Whenever other presidents have suggested it, the Saudis have always said no. And at this particular point in time, it makes particularly little sense for MBS to do or to agree to such a thing. Firstly, Saudi Arabia is itself in the midst of a massive investment program. MBS has been looking at the state of the world. He sees moves around the world to move away from fossil fuels. He worries, as others in Saudi Arabia do, about what will happen to Saudi Arabia and other oil producers once oil ceases to have pole position in the world economy, as it still does today. And MBS has therefore come up with a plan, some would say a very overambitious and ill-thought-out plan. Others say it's a dynamic and forward-looking vision of the future. But whatever it is, he's come up with a plan to try to position Saudi Arabia so that it can be ready for the day when the oil price bonanza it has floated on finally dries up. Well, for that, he needs a high price, or at least a steady price of oil. A low price of oil at a time when Saudi finances are already strained hardly seems in Saudi Arabia's best interests. And if he really is going to invest $600 billion or even $1 trillion in the US economy over the next 4 years, as he might, by the way, decide to do, the Saudis have done this before. They've frequently bought friendship from countries they see as potential protectors by investing oil revenues in their economies. Anyway, if MBS is really going to embark on an investment program in the United States on that kind of scale, on top of the one he already has ongoing in Saudi Arabia itself, then he needs an even higher oil price than he would otherwise do. Now, I say all of this, I ought to say that over the last couple of months, there's actually been a number of articles in places like the Financial Times, which have been talking about the strain on Saudi finances caused by MBS's investment program. So this isn't just, something I'm saying off the top of my head. It is, I think, well understood. So already that makes it look most unlikely that MBS would be interested in flooding the world with cheap oil in the way that Donald Trump wants him to. And then there is the other factor, which is that MBS and the Saudis, for roughly a decade, have worked very hard to establish a good relationship with Russia. And MBS has forged a close and very friendly relationship with Vladimir Putin. Now, it's not been without stresses. There was a moment in 2020 when the two men had a row about the oil price. The Saudis were angry because the Russians weren't cutting production. There was the Russians were angry because the Saudis were making steps in terms of oil pricing, which the Russians didn't agree with. There was a flare-up between Putin and MBS on the phone, but it was all eventually sorted out and settled because these two countries understand that as two of the world's biggest exporters of oil, it is in their interests to maintain a relationship with each other. And of course, Russia is now an active player in the security situation in the Middle East. It has been pushed out of Syria, unquestionably, but it has developed ever closer relations with Iran, and it has maintained its close relations with Turkey. So MBS has every reason, therefore, to value and seek to preserve this relationship. That, too, it seems to me, argues against MBS simply doing Donald Trump's bidding by lowering the price of oil in order to embarrass Putin. And then there is another factor, which is that MBS undoubtedly remembers what happened when the Saudis did take steps to lower the oil price, which was in 2014, in the summer of 2014. Up to that point, oil had been trading at $110 a barrel. The Saudis then started to become increasingly concerned that the major beneficiaries of this high oil price were the shale producers in the United States. So in the summer of 2014, Saudi Arabia launched a price war. It started to do exactly what Donald Trump says that they should do now. It started to increase production and swamp the world with cheaper oil. Oil prices did indeed collapse over the course of the summer and autumn of 2014, and they continued to go downward through 2015, and they bottomed in early 2016, as I remember, at $25 a barrel. And who suffered most as a result of all of that? The short answer is the Saudis. The Russians, with a much bigger and far more diversified economy than most people seem to understand, managed to sail through. At the time, they were inflicting very high interest rates on themselves, as they are, by the way, doing today. They did experience recessions during this time, but certainly nothing that came anywhere close to collapse. The Russian budget withstood the pressure. The Russians did what they always do, which is that they allowed the value of the ruble to fall on global markets, which meant that the money going to the budget from oil sales preserved most of its ruble price. And no one should be in any doubt that the Russians would be perfectly willing to do the same thing. And as for the shale producers in the United States, though at times it looked touch and go, they found that people on Wall Street at that time were willing to go on extending credit lines to them, and they were able to come through. By contrast, the Saudis found that their capital reserves were dwindling, that the strains were increasing. Saudi Arabia is far more dependent on oil than Russia is. And then when the old king, King Abdullah, died, and the new king, King Salman, succeeded him, with MBS rapidly establishing himself as the crown prince, well, the Saudis decided that the policy had failed, and they carried out an abrupt change. And that abrupt change, by the way, included establishing OPEC Plus and establishing good relations with the Russians so as to work with the Russians to stabilize the oil market. So, given that this is so, I come again back to the question, why would MBS go there again, do all over again that which went very badly wrong for the Saudis in 2014, 2016, from the 2014-2016 period? Why would he do that? In order to help Donald Trump in Ukraine. Well, I'm going to say I don't think it's going to happen. I think that MBS, if he's asked to do this by Donald Trump, will respond in that typically courteous, polite Saudi way, the way that the Saudis always use with outsiders. But he'll explain in a very measured way that though he fully understands Donald's concerns and what a terrible war the war in Ukraine is, at the moment this isn't really practical, and that the stability of the oil market is ultimately more important than these attempts to manipulate the oil market in the way that Donald Trump apparently thinks it should be manipulated. On that point, that brings me, in fact, to the most important point of all, because what Trump here is trying to do is trying to use Saudi Arabia like a tap, which he can turn on and off whenever he likes. He wants the Saudis to lower the oil price at his bidding, and who knows, at some other day he might want the Saudis to increase the oil price at his bidding. The Saudis will never agree to that. For the Saudis, the oil price is an absolutely existential issue. It is at the core of their existing economy. The people who decide Saudi oil prices are the Saudis themselves and no one else. And ultimately, they will not take kindly to attempts by Donald Trump or anyone else to strong-arm them into manipulating the oil price in any particular direction. This, again, is something which Americans sometimes have difficulty understanding. But again, the lesson of what happened when the G7 states imposed the $60 oil price cap on Russian oil ought to have educated them, because the Saudis didn't take well to that at all. Even if it was Russian oil rather than Saudi oil which was being affected, it was nonetheless the consumer countries, the G7, dictating prices. And that is not something that the Saudis would ever tolerate. So, this idea that Donald Trump has is simply not going to be achieved. And by the way, those who know that very well are the Russians. The Russians are in contact with the Saudis all the time. Putin speaks to MBS on a regular basis. The Russian energy ministers and the Saudi oil ministers are in regular contact. OPEC Plus continues to function. The Russians have a much better understanding here of Saudi oil policy, certainly than Donald Trump does, and than I suspect many Americans do. All right, let's move on and let's look to the other country that Donald Trump is looking to for help to put pressure on the Russians, and that's China. Well, as it happens, just a few days ago, the Chinese and Russian leaders, President Putin and Xi Jinping, had a virtual summit with each other. Now, the Russians have not produced a readout. In fact, the Russians generally avoid providing readouts of conversations between Putin and Xi Jinping. The Kremlin only published the introductory comments. But the Chinese, as they often do, when a meeting, and this is a virtual meeting, is made public, anyway, the Chinese did publish a readout. And it's not actually, in some respects, a very informative readout. It doesn't tell us very much about the substance of what was discussed, And for the record, I understand that the substance of what was discussed was the new spur of the Power of Siberia pipeline, Power of Siberia 2. There's recently been agreements about its route, which will be through Kazakhstan. There's the perennial issues about pricing. The leaders of the countries tend to come together to sort out those sort of things, and that's probably what happened. In fact, I'm sure that was what happened over the course of this meeting. But of course, neither the Russians nor the Chinese want to talk about that, and we've got instead a Chinese readout which talks about relations with Russia in glowing terms. It starts with this. The two presidents exchanged New Year greetings. This is the Chinese New Year. President Xi expressed his pleasure in having a virtual meeting with President Putin just a few days before the Chinese Spring Festival and shared his hope for a flourishing China-Russia relationship in the year ahead. President Putin responded by expressing his pleasure to talk to President Xi via video link at the beginning of the new year. He wished President Xi and the Chinese people a happy Spring Festival and all the best. And then we go on to read about how Putin and Xi had 3 meetings over the course of 2024. They came to all kinds of common understandings and agreements with each other. How all of these agreements were achieved in a spirit of lasting good neighborliness and friendship, comprehensive strategic cooperation, mutually beneficial cooperation, and how all of this demonstrated renewed vitality. We then go on to read about how President Xi himself stressed his readiness to work with President Putin to guide China-Russia relations to a new height in 2025, to respond to external uncertainties with the stability and resilience of China-Russia ties, to boost the development and prosperity of both countries, and to uphold international fairness and justice. He underscored the need for the two countries to deepen strategic cooperation, firmly support each other, and defend their legitimate interests. Well, there you have it. Underscored the need for the two countries to deepen strategic coordination, firmly support each other. Does that sound like the kind of thing that a Chinese leader would say if he's prepared to put pressure on his friend, President Putin, at the request of Donald Trump? Well, it doesn't seem likely to me, especially not in the larger context of this readout, of which I've only read a part, by the way. It continues along very much the same lines, with commitments by Russia to support China over Taiwan, and also to support each other's positions on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, which is going to take place this year. So the point is that already it looks most unlikely that the Chinese are going to put pressure on the Russians because President Trump wants them to. In fact, the Chinese have been asked by the Biden administration, by the European Union, by an endless procession of European officials to put pressure on the Russians over Ukraine, to sacrifice their economic relationship and maybe their long-term relationship with the Russians by putting pressure on the Russians in Ukraine, and the Chinese have consistently resisted. Now, why should that change? Why is there any reason to believe it will change? Simply because the person in the Oval Office has changed. Again, I fail to see the reason here. What is Trump offering the Chinese, for one thing, to get them to change their stance with respect to Russia? Nothing. Is he going to make significant concessions over Taiwan? For the moment, no sign of that. Is he prepared to give up his various threats to impose sanctions on their trade? I don't think so. And if Trump is prepared to make those kind of concessions, he's going to find that his base, his electoral base, which probably voted for him in part because they support those tariffs, they will be angry. They will not understand why Trump is sacrificing his goal of tariffs against Chinese goods to bail out Zelensky and please Xi Jinping. Just saying. So, personally, I would, by the way, quickly hasten to add, even if Trump offered the Chinese those sort of bargains, I still don't think the Chinese would take them. The Chinese definitely are deeply transactional in the way they conduct their foreign policy. Most countries, by the way, are. And China definitely is. But from the Chinese point of view, the relationship with Russia is seminally important. It is with Russia as a partner that the BRICS group and the Belt and Road Initiative and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and all of these things taken together can be built up. Without the Russians, another great power, it all starts to look very much like a Chinese project. And there's a good chance that in that case, the whole BRICS system will unravel. The Chinese also know that their relationship with Russia gives them leverage over the United States. I mean, they can always remind the Americans that they have their friends too, and that their friends are in the United States' strategic backyard, which is in Europe. And of course, and lastly, the Chinese are very, very anxious to develop their economic relationship with Russia. They're now importing increasing amounts of energy from Russia. They want that energy flow to increase. They want access to Russian grain and food and strategic minerals and many, many other things. They are perfectly well aware that the Russians have recently taken control of an important lithium deposit in Ukraine near the village of Shevchenko. So, one way or the other, there is no logic at all here in expecting that the Chinese will again put pressure on the Russians simply at Donald Trump's bidding. It's not going to happen. And the sooner Donald Trump recognizes this, the better for him it would be. Now, that doesn't mean that the United States should not talk to China about Ukraine. It's overlooked, but 2 years ago, Xi Jinping actually appointed his own peace envoy to try to broker some kind of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. His name is Li Hui, and he's carried out various trips to Moscow and to Kiev, and he has been very courteously received every time he has gone to Moscow, and he's sometimes had extremely unfriendly receptions in Kiev. Might it not be a good idea for General Kellogg to exchange notes with Li Hui? Just saying. I can't really believe that the Americans are going to do that. And here again, we come back to the problem. The Americans are not going to involve the Chinese in the diplomacy over Ukraine. They want to run it themselves. Donald Trump absolutely wants to run it himself. Just as Donald Trump wants to treat Saudi Arabia as a tap that he can turn on and off whenever he chooses, where oil is concerned, so he wants to treat China as a tap that he can turn on and off when the question of pressure on Russia is concerned. neither Saudi Arabia nor obviously China will be treated in that way. So there it is. Without, I think, intending to, Donald Trump, over the last couple of days, has actually informed the Russians that he doesn't have strong cards. He's made suggestions about things that the Saudis might do and that the Chinese might do that aren't going to impress the Russians at all, because they know that the Saudis and the Chinese won't jump to Trump's dictation. And as for the attempts that the Biden administration carried out in its last days to impose oil sanctions, further oil sanctions on Russia, targeting Russia's so-called shadow fleet, well, already India has been responding. And the way it has been responding, again, should be a warning, because what the Indians are doing is not reconsidering their energy relationship with Russia. They've been deciding instead to expand the range of Russian insurance companies that ships sailing with oil to Russia can obtain insurance from. So, anyway, one way or the other, Donald Trump, in my opinion, needs to perhaps put it on pause. He said altogether too much. He's allowed the media to box him in with answers which really he shouldn't have given. I don't think the damage is anywhere close to being beyond repair, but we've seen that the Russians are already making stronger statements because they're sensing that they're up against a party with an incoherent negotiating position. And I think the best thing for Donald Trump to do is to lie low, let his team arrange that telephone call with Putin, have that summit meeting with Putin at some point within the next 100 days, and see then what, if anything, can be done. I am very skeptical myself that anything can actually be done. And if after 100 days it becomes clear, those 100 days, it becomes clear that a settlement, and notice that Peskov has said that, we shouldn't talk about deals, we should talk about settlements. Deals is again language from the commercial world, not from the world of international conflict management and diplomacy. If a settlement cannot be reached, then Donald Trump needs to decide what to do. Does he double down, follow the line that the Biden administration has taken, continue to send arms to Ukraine in ever-dwindling numbers against increasing opposition, probably from members of his own party and to the alarm of his own base, owning the defeat in Ukraine when it eventually comes, or does he finally say, enough, I've done what I can, I'm going to walk away, and I'm going to leave it to the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Europeans to the extent that they can to sort it out between them, that the United States has other, more pressing and more important things to do. Well, I hope he takes the second course rather than the first. But in the meantime, if there's going to be a negotiated settlement at all in Trump's first term, I think he needs to speak less. He needs to give the Russians less reason to think that he is anxious. I'm not sure that he is anxious, but as I said, constantly saying that he wants to meet with Putin and that he wants to do a deal conveys to the Russians the sense that he is. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, who obviously does not want negotiations, but he's actually onto a point. He said it shouldn't be Trump asking Putin for negotiations. It should be Putin asking the West, begging, pleading for negotiations. Well, of course, that's never, ever going to happen. But the point is that in negotiations of this kind, it will always look as if it is the party with the weaker hand that is anxious for them. And looking too anxious can convey to the other side that you're in a weaker position than the one you want to show. And as I said, as for the Saudis and the Chinese, I think Trump needs to be more realistic and talk less about these things. And also perhaps understand something else, that reducing inflation, which ought to be his priority, it is after all what he was mostly elected to do. It was what his base wants. They've been suffering over the 4 years of the Biden administration from a cost of living crisis, and they want that to end. Anyway, the way to do that, if he wants to do it quickly, if he wants to achieve an immediate effect in terms of oil prices, the way he could do that would be by taking the opposite direction to the one that he is taking now, which is by relaxing sanctions on the Russian oil industry. After all, it was the Biden administration and the Europeans imposing sanctions on the Russian oil industry, which caused the surge in energy costs, which sparked the inflation in the first place. Trump could reverse that, and that would bring energy prices down. But unfortunately, or at least in my opinion, unfortunately, his comments of the last couple of days shows that that possibility has either not even occurred to him, or that he has straightforwardly rejected it. Anyway, there we are. That's Trump taking, in my opinion, a remarkably ill-conceived negotiating position in the first couple of days. Trump can right himself. He's done that before. His dealings with North Korea also started very badly in his first term, and then he eventually had a friendly meeting with Kim Jong-un in Singapore and then subsequently in Hanoi. As I said, it was John Bolton, not Trump, who wrecked that promising diplomatic initiative. So there's still time for Donald Trump to change course, but we'll see if he does. Anyway, let's return now quickly to the state of the war, because that continues. And again, this is another point which I think Donald Trump needs to understand. Not only have the Russians, in effect, already won the war, but more importantly, the time window left to Ukraine is steadily closing. The Russians are not only winning the war, but with every step, every day, they're taking another step closer to the river, to the Dnieper. And we've heard critical news from Velikaya Novosilka in southwestern Donbass. This is one of the most terrible episodes of the war. Maps which have now been produced show this actually very small place. It's about 6,000 people before the war, so I understand, is now not only completely encircled, but that the Russians have cut it in two. Every part of it that is still nominally under Ukrainian control is being bombed. There were reports yesterday that the Russians are dropping leaflets and sending radio messages to the Ukrainian troops in the southern area of Novolikaya, Novosilka to surrender. That appears to be the entire 110th Brigade of the Ukrainian army. And which seems astonishing that an entire brigade could be sacrificed in that way. But anyway, this is a terrible battle. And it has only gone on as long as it has in Velikaya Novosilka, because the Ukrainians again took the disastrous decision of trying to cling on to that town as long as possible, with the result that some of their best troops are being sacrificed pointlessly in the process. But in some ways, even more disturbing for the Ukrainians must be the news that is now coming from the Pokrovsk area, where it now looks as if the Russians are not only gaining more ground south west of Pokrovsk, but also in the area around the village of Vozdvizhenka. It seems that over the last couple of weeks, it's winter after all, there's been considerable cloud cover over Ukraine, and this has slowed the operation of the Russian Air Force somewhat, though it should be said that bombing with FABs has never at any time fully stopped. But it's likely that over the next couple of weeks, the bombing is going to resume at something like the same level of intensity that we were seeing in the summer and autumn. And with the Ukrainian army about to lose not just Velikaya Novosilka, but the troops that were defending it, and with the Ukrainian forces in Pokrovsk now very much at risk of being encircled, and with the Russians apparently now about to complete the capture of the coal mine near Toretsk and close to clearing Chasiv Yar. Well, if all of that happens, and the air force is again unleashed, and we see bombing resume at the same level, well, then I just shudder to think what the effect of all of this is going to be. In the Kursk region, in the meantime, the Ukrainians have just released film of the Ukrainians shelling advanced Russian positions right on the outskirts of Svedlikovo. Now, this is the village that lies a short distance north of the main road that leads from Sumy region to Suja. So it looks as if the Russians are literally on the brink of advancing into this village, the village of Svedlikovo. Now, likely the Ukrainians will want to defend this village, and we will have a fierce battle fought out for control of this village. But in Kursk region as well, it looks as if the vice is slowly closing. The Russians have made significant progress southwest of Suja. Now they're making progress northeast of Suja as well. From both directions, they're coming closer and closer to the main road. If this road is closed, and the Ukrainian forces in Suja, and perhaps we're more justified talking about the Suja pocket than the Kursk pocket, if this pocket is closed, if we get a cauldron developing here, then it will be a disaster greater than any disaster the Ukrainian army has suffered in any of the campaigns it has fought against the Russians since the beginning of the 2014 crisis. It will be a bigger disaster by far. Anyway, there we are. I will probably return to a more detailed discussion of the state of the war tomorrow. We will see what Trump does. Now, Seymour Hersh US reporter, investigative reporter. He's published an article, which I've read just before I made this video, saying that there have in fact already been lots of discussions between the Ukrainians and the Russians and the Americans and the Russians behind the scenes, and that we're actually quite close to a settlement. Seymour Hersh is getting this from American sources. I have to say, I don't believe these sources. I think that the open information that we're getting so completely contradicts what these sources are saying that I simply cannot believe that this is true. But no doubt, over the next couple of days, someone in the White House and the White House team and in the State Department will contact their opposite numbers in Moscow and will get this phone call with Putin set up. I have to say, I'm a little surprised and a little dismayed that that doesn't seem to have happened already. There was a flap yesterday when Putin was participating in a meeting in discussing strategic development programs in Russia, when he suddenly said that he had to exit the meeting to field an international call. Some people jumped to the conclusion that it was Donald Trump on the line. In fact, it was the president of Equatorial Guinea, just saying. But a person who, by the way, Putin most definitely would want to speak to. But the point is, I am surprised that there hasn't yet been this Trump-Putin call. I would have expected it to be arranged and to take place within hours of Trump's inauguration. Perhaps Trump, making all of these statements that he's done over the last couple of days, is intended to prepare the ground for that call. Perhaps Trump, in his own mind, believes that by talking tough in the way that he has done, he's pushing Putin into a corner, or at least into a place where Trump wants him to be. As I have discussed at length in this program, the reality is almost exactly the opposite. The sooner the call happens, the better it will be. And in the meantime, silence is golden, and that is the rule that Trump should follow. Well, that's my program for today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video. Don't forget, you can also check out our you can also support our this channel by ticking the like button to this video if you've liked this video, and by checking your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.